Shalom, this is Daniel Jester coming to you from the Jerusalem area, and we're presenting some short videos that lead us into a course on the application of Torah in the New Covenant order. I'm so glad to be with you. I represent a ministry called Restoration from Zion of Tikkun Global, and you can connect to us by looking us up on Restoration from Zion or tikkun.tv. And you'll find a list of our books and a list of the different things that we're involved in. And we'd love you to sign up for our newsletter and to become connected to our ministry. A good part of it is teaching, but not only that, establishing congregations, mentoring leaders, and so much more. I want to begin by saying to you that we have just over the last year put out in Tikkun a new publication, almost, I think it's 900 to 1,000 pages, called Torah in Messiah. The primary author of that is a disciple of mine whose name is Michael Rudolph, even though he's older than I am. And I was the, not the co-author, but kind of like the assistant author, part of a lot of it. And this 900-page, 2-volume set helps you to know how to apply the Torah in the New Covenant, all of those Torah laws that can be applied that aren't contingent on there being a temple. So I'm recommending that, and if you go on the website, you can see that. You will also find a lot of my books dealing with these issues like Jewish roots, my book Social Justice, and there are many more. I want to begin by first summarizing what is the Torah. Now, I'm mostly going to be talking about Exodus through Deuteronomy, but I just want to say that the first 5 books of Moses are the foundations for understanding God and His purpose for Israel and the nations. If you don't have the Torah, you can't understand the New Covenant. Somebody said, is the Torah more important than the New Covenant scriptures? No. The ultimate importance is the New Covenant scriptures. In one sense, however, because without the Torah, the New Covenant scriptures don't make sense. They can't be bringing us to that point of fulfillment. And in another sense, the Torah is the foundation without which you don't have New Covenant scriptures. So there's another sense in which the Torah is the really important thing. But the meaning of how we enter into relationship with the Lord today is in the New Covenant. Now, several years ago, there was a scholar at the University of Michigan whose name was George Mendenhall, who began to study the covenant treaties of the Middle East and the ancient Near East. He studied Assyrian treaties, and he studied the treaties of the Hittites, the ancient Hittites, and he found that these treaties provide a basis of cultural context for understanding the Torah from Exodus to Deuteronomy especially. When we deal with the book of Genesis, we're dealing with the foundations of God's relationship with the patriarchs, first creation, and then we come to the story of the patriarchs, and that's the center of Genesis, and the Abrahamic covenant is the foundational covenant upon which everything depends, and that is an everlasting covenant where God promises to bless Abraham, to give his seed, the Jewish people, the land of Israel, which was called the land of Canaan back at that time, and to, through Abraham's seed, bless all nations, to bring a reversal of the fall and to bring the nations back into right relationship with God. And hence, he says, I will, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Now, but then we have this thing called the law, or the Torah, which really means instruction, although the instruction of God is, some people shy away from the concept of law, and they say, oh, it's just instruction, it doesn't mean laws. But let's face it, the Torah is full of commandments and laws, listed one after another, so we can't dismiss that. But what Mendenhall was finding was that the context, the form in which these laws were placed and the stories were placed from Exodus through Deuteronomy are placed in a context of covenant treaty form, especially the 10 Commandments and especially the book of Deuteronomy. And the covenant treaty form that it appears to be closest to is the 15th century BC Hittite treaties. The person who really brought this to a greater power of presentation was a scholar who was at Westminster Seminary and then Gordon Conwell Divinity School. His name was Dr. Meredith Kline, and he wrote a book called Treaty of the Great King, which is an incredibly wonderful book. I consider it a classic, telling us about the covenant nature of the Mosaic writings. And then he wrote what I consider an extraordinary book, I wish everybody would read it, called The Structure of Biblical Authority. The Structure of Biblical Authority. But the argument of Kline, and you have to get into the larger course to get it in detail, is that the book of Deuteronomy especially, so let's work backward from that, fits the covenant treaty form of the ancient Hittites, and the form of that treaty fits exactly a pattern where the king says, I am entering into a covenant with you solely on the basis of my grace, not on the basis of your earning it or good works. That I have rescued you, I'm entering into this covenant with you to protect you solely on the basis of my magnificent grace, and on the basis of my offering this treaty to you. If you say yes, then you will be my obedient subjects out of gratitude for me. So first comes the offer of grace and salvation, and then comes the gratitude. So we see this where God says in Deuteronomy, this is because of my love for you, my love for your ancestors, the patriarchs. It is because of my grace that I pulled you out of Egypt through no works of your own, and I'm bringing you into the promised land. And on the basis of my salvation by grace, I'm calling you to a life of obedience to my covenant. So as Kline says, covenant is the right term for describing the writings of Moses or Torah. Covenant is the right word, not law. Law is a part of it, but covenant is the right word. So I like to talk about this material as the Mosaic covenantal materials. And when you study the Torah, you find, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, but we'll mention this in the Ten Commandments as well, you go through a preamble in the beginning, which announces what the document is in the first chapter, and then you go through a historical prologue in verses 1 through 4, and that historical prologue continues back and forth till the 10th chapter, but the basic introduction is there, and then it continues with historical material. And it's in those chapters up to chapter 10 where we read consistently of God saying, it's not through your works, it's through my grace, it's through my love, it's through my faithfulness to your ancestors, and you're called to be a distinct witness people. And then up until chapter 26, we have stipulations of the covenant, and this is where we get the laws, the commandments, the instructions that the people are to keep. And to recognize that it's not like the letters of Paul, really personal, loving things written to you personally. This is a constitution for a nation. This is how the nation of Israel is to be governed. It directs their courts, it directs their issues of tort law and how laws are to be enforced and what the penalties are for violation. And then after that, it goes into the blessings and cursings for obedience and disobedience, which is exactly what you find in the Hittite treaties. And then after that, you find instructions for succession of government and for a deposit of the covenant into the official archives of both governments. Have to put that covenant in their archives. In the case of Israel, it's in the temple. And the archives, therefore, maintain that covenant as a written document before the people and before the ruling king and before the subject nation. So Israel is the vassal nation to the great king who is called a suzerain. So this is a vassal treaty. Deuteronomy is a vassal treaty, and we're going to go over that. So I think that it's a really important correction of a lot of theology out there to note that the Mosaic covenant is a covenant of grace.